Hello and welcome to another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action, a series where leaders look back at decisions they've made and consider a series of questions. I'm Peter Stiepelman, I'm your host, and I'm an imperfect leader. I spent more than 20 years teaching and leading, first in the Oakland Public Schools in Oakland, California, and then in the Midwest, Missouri to be exact, where I was a teacher and a principal and assistant superintendent and then the superintendent of the fourth largest district in the state. I'm constantly striving to learn from my experiences and from the experiences of other leaders. The aim of this podcast is to lift the learning and lift the imperfect leaders up. That way, when you hear the term imperfect, you'll see strength. Strength from the candor needed to recognize imperfection as a real advantage. Let's get started. Let me just start off this episode by telling you something about Dave MacLeod. Dave is a 6-foot-tall white man. Now, you'll hear him say this a couple of times in our conversation, and here's why that's important. Did you know that studies have shown that there are more CEOs named David in the Fortune 500 than there are female CEOs in total? Furthermore, the majority of those CEOs are white males and are 6 feet tall. I've put a link to the study in the episode notes. And why was Dave telling me this? It was to raise a really important point about the role of a leader to take on difficult topics, especially when they are in a position to do so. Although Dave didn't say this explicitly, he really does seem to suggest that he recognizes that there is no hierarchy of pain, that all insult and pain are destructive to the human spirit. There are, however, more opportunities for women, for people of color, for individuals with disabilities, for religious minorities, for those whose sexual or gender identity or expression are not part of the majority. In Dave's after-action review, he would say, don't shy away from the responsibility to do the right thing. However, be mindful of the way that you go about using your position to engage in difficult dialogues. Dave MacLeod is my first non-superintendent, but his professional work has been in the service of making the job of the superintendency a whole lot easier. So I'm really excited about this episode with ThoughtExchange's CEO, Dave MacLeod. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dave MacLeod is my guest. Dave is not a superintendent, but he and the company he leads, ThoughtExchange, have helped superintendents across the nation harvest the wisdom of their communities to make better decisions. Dave, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Great to be here.
So Dave, in the early years of leadership, I relied on a few ways to gather information from stakeholders. Really, they were traditional methods. I would hold evening meetings to hear from parents and guardians. I'd hold faculty meetings to hear what faculty was thinking. Oh, I'd even attend grade level meetings if I really wanted to dig into a situation. I'd talk to kids outside in the cafeteria, out on the playground. If I wanted to get a child's perspective, they would tweet at me on snow days to tell me to rethink my decision about having school or to lobby for a snow day. But of course, what I would see what people were saying on social media and certainly through emails to further widen the net of gathering perspectives. Sometimes on like a really big issue, we might hold like a town hall, or we'd administer a survey, and often we'd make pretty good decisions or at least defensible ones. And often we just weren't totally sure we knew whether we had truly harvested the wisdom of our internal and external stakeholders. And then we also didn't know if like we had common ground within a specific group, or whether there was a specific third alternative that we could all consider and rally behind. And then we learned about ThoughtExchange. And so, sorry for the really long question there, although I'm not even sure I've asked one yet, which is, can you tell us just a little bit about ThoughtExchange?
Well, that's a big question. So let me see if I can dig into that. What ThoughtExchange is for education is, we have now suppose 600 school districts across North America, representing millions of kids. There's been millions of people involved in sharing their thoughts. But maybe what's most interesting is that I am not a technologist by trade. So roll back the clock 13 years. I was a face-to-face facilitator. I was someone you might hire as a consultant to come in and run a contentious town hall meeting. I had a leadership business. I was a consultant. I famously tell a lot of superintendents, I went to 4 different universities, got exactly 0 degrees, which qualified myself to be an entrepreneur and a consultant, of course. But what's important about that is that I learned a lot about facilitation. I was an outdoor guide. I did leadership training for adults and for kids. And I got good at running big meetings. And along the way, I got really frustrated with one major thing. It was actually who showed up in the meeting. And I did have a facilitation technique that, do you know the sticky notes where you get people to write their thoughts on sticky notes and you give them dots and they put the dots on the sticky notes?
Don't insult the dots. I'm a big believer in dots, but I think you're about to tell me that dots.
Well, here's the problem, right? Is that, so here I am, a white 6 foot tall male named Dave running a meeting, and that just talks about my unearned privilege. And if that's a question mark, I invite you to dig in. But I'm this consultant that actually is gathering these people, and then I get them to write down these thoughts on the sticky notes, and then I get to put them in groups and themes. There's my first bias that I'm putting onto. I'm the one that says, well, I guess all of you have said something similar to this. The next thing that happens, you give everyone their sticky dots, and then a curiosity was that the first person would go up and put a dot on, and everyone would watch. So where did that person put their dot? And you could see the room kind of watching where the dots were happening. So they didn't want to be seen to be putting on a dot on something that maybe wasn't a popular area, because now they're the ones putting a dot on it. And it became sort of a political process. So along the way, I found this way of doing, agenda setting differently or strategic priorities differently, which is just give everyone a recipe card. You get everyone to write down, this is what I think we should be talking about, and this is why. And they shuffle it around the room, score, without signing a name, shuffle, score, shuffle, score, shuffle, score. And then you'd have this high rated, you'd start counting backwards from 35. And by the time you got to, 30, 29, some say bingo. You say, okay, great. There is an agenda item that's pretty important for us. Would you agree? And everyone said, actually, yeah, that seemed like a really fair process. Everyone's voice mattered. Everyone got a chance to write a thought. No one assigned their name, their gender, their authority, anything to that thought. And so the group would then rate those thoughts, and then everyone would say, yeah, I agree, this is what's really important. And this worked with some really complex negotiation issues around mining, around indigenous health, around financial planning, around all sorts of things, because different parties have different needs. And they're like, well, I guess that was a fair process. And when people buy into a fair process, they buy into a fair outcome. I tell you that long story to start off this conversation because a friend of a friend invited me to meet a guy named Jim Firstbrook and his team of developers who were building wisdom of crowd software. And I thought to myself, not interested. I don't actually care. I love face-to-face. I love facilitation. I'm an in-the-room person. I like the energy and feeling of being face-to-face. I don't like how technology intervenes. And Jim also heard about me going out doing these consultations and basically said, that sounds terrible. This has nothing to do with collective intelligence. I'm a physicist. I'm an engineer. I'm a software developer. And what does this guy know?
Worst pre-dating ever.
Exactly. Yeah. But thanks to some perseverance, Jim agreed, and I ended up seeing the first ever, it was ThoughtStream at the time. I saw the first ever beta release. And I thought to myself, as I saw that, wow, infinite recipe cards. That was literally the thought I had. Infinite recipe cards that could be put in any language, and it solves for my biggest problem. Who's in the room? And so that was 13 years ago. And from there, we realized that this tool now has the ability to give everyone's right to their voice, to be able to share the thinking, but not only share the thinking, to actually have people share thinking and then consider the thoughts of other people and together decide what's important.
So, and Scaling Conversations, the book?
Yeah. So Scaling Conversations is basically a book I wrote about all the people I've met along the way. Because if you're part of creating ability to ask a question to 100, 1,000, 10,000 people, then it becomes, what question do you ask and why? So the book is all about the fact that the needs of a school district, the needs of a business exist within a hierarchy. And that hierarchy of needs is about how, listen, you have some fundamental needs that if they're not addressed, if there's COVID happening, if there's safety happening, here's the joke I tell at superintendent conferences. Somebody walks into your office, they're visibly upset. They've been recently crying. They sit down in front of you and they're about to talk. And you say, wait, before you talk, what is one thing you appreciate about the district? And what's your big idea for the 2030 strategic plan? Right? That's a cringe-worthy thing to say. And I say, but of course you'd never do that. And then I challenge them to say, but also, do you do that? Like as a brand, as a district, are you reaching out to say, what do you appreciate about the district and what's your vision for the strategic plan when you haven't actually found a mechanism to say, What's on your mind? Do you have a concern? So there's a bit of conversational intelligence that needs to happen in organizations to be able to scale a conversation. Like, what are the concerns you have around the safety of our schools? What's on your mind as it relates to our facilities? So that by the time you want to talk about legacy questions and multi-generational continuity, you actually have a method to say that, listen, you would never go to any of your staff and step over the hierarchy of needs. And that's what the whole book is about. It's not something I made up. It's something I've learned over a decade of this. Is there's a bit of a methodology to which questions you can ask to which people at what time to get to the outcome that of actually creating a legacy in your organization.
So my introduction to ThoughtExchange happened to be at a Missouri Association of School Administrators, and I typically would shy away from talking to anybody. And I happened to talk to somebody from ThoughtExchange, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I'm looking for in terms of how do I move away from what really feels like a vote when the loudest voice would come to a World Cafe or something like that, and would strategically move from table to table, writing a very similar sort of, this is what you need to be working on, and then sort of organizing through emails and things like that, and really shifting the conversation away from really what I believe to be, and to your point, that was all resting on me, what I believed, as opposed to finding some different way to really harvest that wisdom. And I use that term a lot. And I'm going to follow up with this question for you, because I'm kind of curious about, in terms of scaling conversations and looking for the right question. So there's a leadership model that I use to advise others. And there's a dimension there called leaders learning work. And that's really the mind or the brains of the model. And inside that dimension is that term, harvest collective wisdom. And for most superintendents and leaders in general, we just use those traditional models or methods that I shared earlier. And we ask people, again, really to essentially vote. And then we tally the votes and we make a decision. If we make a decision that's contrary to what is perceived to be the vote, really there's this sort of like real sort of real protest by some of the community. But ThoughtExchange approaches these types of wildly complex issues by framing the question, or framing a question to really get at what are people thinking. And I wonder would you tell us a little bit about what you've learned about asking the right question? Yeah. There's a real art in that. There's a real art in asking the question.
There is an art, and not a day goes by that we don't go deeper on the art of asking the right question. Let me put this up at the top of the pile. Here's my number one piece of advice to any superintendent or leader trying to figure out what question to ask their students, staff, community. Don't be weird, is my advice. What I mean by that is that, like, you can do a bit of a check on yourself to say, well, I don't know, we got to make a bit of I got my cabinet in front of me. We got to make a call, but whether we're going to support a particular learning program or not. All right, I got them sitting in front of me. What am I going to do? All right, there's 10 of you. I'm going to get 4 of you to vote. And then after you vote, I'm going to say, all right, well, that looks like a 3-1. So that's what we're going to do. Right? That would be like crazy. Like, you'd never do that. You'd also never say, hi, everyone. In order to optimize student success and health, what are the 3 most important aspects of a learning program that you feel that the district needs to prioritize as we forward learning to ensure the success for all, while making sure all children have an equitable access to an education, and realizing that there's systemic issues that need to be addressed from now and for 2030?
You know, I do feel like the questions I ask you are pretty much that long. So I'm not that offended by that question. Yeah, but you're right, right? It's like, what are you asking me? You get so lost in the question, right?
Now, your question, not that your questions are long. It's that what I find that,
well, and the vocabulary and and sort
using
of
relational language. You're using, like, let's talk, like let's provide some relational. And you know what, the best leaders right now that are asking questions to their community are saying things like, listen, we're doing our best. COVID's been a really tough time. Learning outcomes have dropped down a bunch, and we're doing our best to make sure that those issues are being addressed for all our kids. And we'd really like to hear from you. Hey, what do you think's going well? And what are some things that challenges that are up in front of you you'd like us to be aware of? If that's the language that you would speak to your cabinet, then that's a really good language to speak to your community, because they will relate to you when they see you face to face. And maybe you're a more formal person. Maybe you do speak in a bit more formal way. But if you're an informal, we have people saying, listen, we want to know how we're doing. Any thoughts? And they actually send that question to their community by putting a video out and saying, like, here's all the stuff happening, and we really want to know your thoughts of how we're doing. So in this new world of communication, my coaching of don't be weird, it sort of means like do a gut check on your leadership and who you are and how you relate to people in a way that allows them to empathize and build trust, and then put that in to the sort of question you might ask. Because let's take that example of like, here's an example, start times. You know, we've had people pre-ThoughtExchange say, listen, they did a 30,000 student district, they sent out a poll, they heard back from 800 people, and it came back 46-54. And they're like, well, that's about 50-50. So, you know, we had 2 start times. It came back about 50-50. So we decided to do this one. Happens to be the 46-54. But you know what? It was only 800 people. There's 100,000 people affected by this decision. So we just thought it was 50-50. So we went with this one. That ends up with, as you said, pickets. You know, there was, in one case, there was like the news came by and we're like, we voted. We told you, we voted. We the what? 300 people voted? No, it was never a vote. Whereas I get a leader to say, well, what question would you ask? A reasonable question. Say, well, I don't know. If you were talking to your cabinet, you'd say, well, we've got a really challenging decision to make about whether or not we're going to change the start time. I know there's a lot of things to consider, but yeah, what are the most important perspectives we need to be considering as we go through this change? That is an example of something you can ask the community. We're about to make a really challenging decision. We'd love to understand what perspectives are really important for us to understand as we make this decision. Locus of control remains in the district, open to perspectives. Anyone can share their perspective, and it'll be extremely valuable. So that's the number one thing we've learned is like, what is the thing you really want to know? How would you articulate that to your cabinet in front of you? And probably you can take that and you can ask your community a very similar question to that. And it's not about what's the vote? What do you think we should do? It's not about making a democratic decision, because you know, you never want people that don't actually have the right information, that they need an expertise to just make a decision that actually impacts a kid's education. But you do want to hear the perspectives of many, many people. In the state of Connecticut, they reached out where the governor was trying to make a call, and they were able to talk to 40,000 people in a couple of days and ask them, we got a big decision to make. What are all the things we need to consider as we're making the call about whether to open schools or not right now? And it sounds like a wildly open question, but it actually informed the whole state as far as the mandate and the decision making around COVID and when they opened right in the heat of it. Because that difference between should we, yes or no, and what do we really need to be thinking about, you can still get at a really similar, people will still stay, you know, open it and close it. But it gives you a body of knowledge that you're able to actually lean into and get at listening to people's values, empathizing with them, understanding, communicating those values back, and then showing that you've made your best attempt to listen to as many people as possible, and then make the right decision. That's, I think, what leaders are meant to do.
An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action is supported by ILAA, a firm dedicated to supporting aspiring new and established leaders. For more information, please find them at human-centeredleaders.com. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader, called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest today is Dave MacLeod, CEO of ThoughtExchange. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we just talk about it. So, Dave, what happened?
Yeah, so I mean, I sort of, when I thought about this question, I sort of wanted to go to 2 directions. I wanted to first, you know, we support hundreds and hundreds of superintendents to go through some pretty challenging decisions. And I wanted to sort of give a quick, snippet of some things that I found to be pretty inspiring. As far as what I'm seeing as the new competency for leadership is actually the ability to be open inside this idea of accepting your mistakes and changing them. And I wanted to give a few examples in that, you know, on a very practical level, there's a superintendent that really had the sense that a school district really wanted to have a football stadium built and had this idea that a legacy was going to be related to this football stadium. Went out and talked to thousands of people, and it was pretty clear that the community actually did not want that. They actually had a bunch of other needs that they'd like to fund through bond financing that was unrelated to that. And what we was able to witness is a superintendent go on stage and say over and over again, I'm sort of happy to be wrong. Like I'm actually, you know, I really had this assumption and I was actually really happy to be wrong. And I saw that superintendent gain a lot of support from the community for actually saying, you've changed my mind publicly. And in fact, roll the clock forward a bunch of years, They actually also built the football stadium later down the road. The timing just wasn't right back then. They eventually got the outcome that they were going for, but they listened to the community. But I think it was all reliant on that leader actually saying, I learned something and I was wrong. Which reminds me of another superintendent that we supported that listened to, after the terrible Parkland shooting, they put on armed foot patrols in their school district. And as an immediate reaction, we've had more than one superintendent do this actually. And then after, just to check in with the community, like, hey, what are your thoughts about our reaction and the armed foot patrols? And they were able to listen to the community, but then found a voice, which was in this case, in New York, was the voice of a minority community, and specifically an African-American community that said, listen, I now feel very unsafe sending my kids to school. The stats are that, my kid could get in a fist fight now and get shot over it. And statistically speaking, this makes me very concerned as a parent. And this actually got elevated up. Everyone rated those thoughts quite high. And it got to the point that they went to the mayor and they went to the police and they shared that data. And that superintendent actually said, listen, this is an example of me addressing my unconscious bias and not fully thinking that we were both trying to create safety for kids. And an action I did actually created a less safe atmosphere. And he stood in front of his community and said, I've learned something big and I want to share with you. And I'm actually going to reverse that decision in alignment with the district, with the police force, et cetera. So I've seen some leaders change some thinking through listening to people in a way that really inspires me. And I just wanted to share that opportunity because in each case, that superintendent was up for the state superintendent of the year. And so this is like the hallmark, I think, of amazing leadership is the ability to listen, to admit your mistakes. I can't dig into their mistakes though. So I want to share one that I made so that you can actually grill me on my mistake in the
perfect. I will say though, before you begin, and I appreciate those two stories because those are profound examples. And, you're describing football. I mean, anyone who's a superintendent recognizes whether they like football or not. That is a big part of a community. And to have to take a decision and say, in terms of the feedback we're getting, it's a not yet, right? It's not a no. It's not now.
It turns out no one wants to give you feedback, but everyone wants to give you advice. And there's actually a really strong way to show that you respect someone, which is to ask them for their advice. You ask them for the feedback. It sounds like I've already made the decision. I'm looking for your feedback.
Yeah, I'm looking for you to agree with me. And if you don't, who are you? I thought we were friends, kind of thing, right? So okay, so advice and counsel probably
advice. Like you're talking to your community, you're asking for advice. Like we want some advice.
Let's talk about your personal example. So you've given us some history about who you are and what you do, and no doubt as you've been growing and building and learning, there are decisions you've made that you would be willing to share with the rest of us. So tell us about what happened.
Yeah. So, the one that comes to mind is, you can probably tell a little bit by my nature of my company that I really, really value transparent communication, and try to address issues that are, even if they're uncomfortable, that we need to address them. And so, without actually repeating history, the story I want to share is that, like, in our company, we decided to address inside an agenda of an all company meeting, sort of like, hey, like basically it was called something like, team update time or something like that on the agenda. And we were sort of, our goal was to be able to talk about some things that were very foundationally important for organizations to take a stance on inside a company for the protection of their staff. So we basically said, we brought into this subject and said, listen, we're going to talk about this. We're going to share some stats. We're going to talk about the importance of this stat. I'm not going to the exact detail, but it's basically, this is a very triggering topic. And we said, we want to talk about this, all of you, and we want to share the disturbing stats related to this. And we want to talk about the fact that we do not condone this. We're going to do every effort so that this sort of thing does not happen inside the walls of our building. I thought what we were doing was being brave to be able to show leadership on talking about very challenging things that many organizations would sweep under the rug and not be willing to have an open and candid conversation about. What happened is that several people had to leave the room. what's worse is that they had to be seen to be leaving the room. I'm going to let that settle in. It was probably the biggest failure of my leadership career, is to have people triggered by the issue that I was trying to help with feel that they got so triggered by the topic that they had to get up and walk out and know that the room was looking at them, and therefore it called them out as someone who was affected by the very thing that I was trying to address. It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible, because it created the exact reverse effect of what I was trying to do, which was to try to address a really hard issue. And these people were basically saying, I'm so impacted by this issue, I can't even be in the room with you. Like, it is as real as what you're talking about. And I cannot, like, you didn't tell me you're talking about this. What are you doing? And what I realized, of course, it'd be very inappropriate to ask, hey, anyone ever had this issue happen? Put up your hand, and then you don't have to come to this session. What I learned is what a mistake it is for a person who's had the privilege of not being affected by something that feels like they can speak and actually have a candid conversation about it without the professional coaching and training to be able to deal with that, thinking that sort of a dedication to raw transparency and a dedication to a big heart and mind is going to be enough. And so, yeah, it created a lot of hurt, where actually my value, my hope was to create the opposite, but I sure didn't. And so that's a decision. The way we handled that I regret. Absolutely.
So here you were, what it sounds like, trying to be preemptive as you're seeing other organizations and corporations around the country and around North America and around the world really struggle with, sounds like something that we're all familiar with. And in this effort to do that, you triggered or essentially, sort of re-victimized individuals, and yet your intentions were to be more inclusive, right? We want to be an organization of inclusion, and we're going to talk about this together. I see a lot of districts that are trying to talk about equity, and they're looking at all the different identities: race, class, sexual orientation, religion, ability, and they do sometimes activities like cross the line if, right? Cross the line if this, cross the line if that, without first considering that when you're asking people to step forward, they may be the only one who've been a victim of assault or the victim of racism, and all eyes on that individual. And so instead of becoming more inclusive, you're really sort of spotlighting one's experiences. I'm curious if you're willing just to talk a little bit about what got overlooked, and then maybe just follow up quickly after what got overlooked with what did you learn about relationships? Because no doubt, because of who you are in the time that we spent together, it is clear that relationships are super important to you. And those relationships had to be sort of rebuilt or to some degree revisited, because that was a really big moment in your career.
I would say that what got overlooked, one thing that got overlooked is that there's a reason why there's expertise around this and a body of knowledge and workers and people that actually understand how to deal with trauma and have some thinking. As an example, afterwards, there's people said, like, listen, there's a real simple practice here, Dave. You're going to talk about something here that's potentially pretty triggering. You can actually just put it on the agenda and write the topic down, and people can choose to attend or not. Give them the dignity to say that, maybe I want to dial into this one, or maybe I suddenly got busy with a doctor's appointment because I don't feel like I actually want to come. So there's some sort of like, you're trying to be transparent, but you sprung the actual, like you said, step over the line. It was like that. You sprung the actual topic on people and didn't give them the right to actually step out of a triggering conversation. And what I was doing is like, everyone has to be here. It is so important that we have this conversation that you are mandated to come here and have this conversation. So what got overlooked is that is just wrong thinking.
Yeah. I imagine people know your heart and they knew your intentions were pure. What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
Yeah, I would say that I would learn that my heart and my intentions weren't good enough. Like that's not enough to say I have good intentions, and therefore I am not guilty of causing harm. And that actually having some of those conversations with people, and then also realizing I had to have some conversations through other people, but that saying I'm sorry is important. Showing learning and trying to figure out ways you can approach things in a better manner. And I'm still absolutely imperfect in doing this, because I have a strong desire to converse about things that are sitting underneath in the systems in all of our society. And yes, it's racism, and yes, it's gender, and yes, it's sexual health, and yes, there's a lot of issues that we need to be talking about. But as we go through those things, that the relationships with people around you and surrounding yourself with people that actually take this on as a profession and have some understanding turns out to be really important. And I mean, I've since surrounded myself with some pretty amazing people, and made some really amazing relationships with these groups that have been able to say, like, listen, we can point out some pretty obvious things that you're doing wrong, and we'd love to help you. Like we love to help you. Thank you for being an idiot. Thank you for screwing it up and doing it the wrong way. And we'd love to help you. And by the way, we were always here. Maybe it's like, we were always here, and you can always surround yourself by people, especially when it's things that are just out of your depth. I will also characterize that as a white male named Dave, who's 6 foot tall, I live into the tendency to just do things that I don't have, that, like, we as a characterization do things that are out of our depth, just feeling like it's going to be fine, because we've actually experienced statistically a lot less bias against us.
Yeah. There are fewer opportunities for you to face any type of discrimination, and so the risk taking, it feels more comfortable, because right. The ripple effect is you're almost immune to it. Right. What frustrated you?
What frustrated me was the thing he said, is that I want so much to change these things for the better, and it's just so frustrating to make it worse.
Yeah. Dismantling systems of oppression can't be done overnight. And yet it sounds like you are impatient, right? And it's like, okay, so what can I do? How do I use my position and my privilege to be able to dismantle these systems? When you work to change that system, the system will work aggressively to return to stasis, no matter how many, right? And so here you were trying to do something about that. What you're doing is really demonstrating how leaders are human, and how they can reflect in a very public way, and also maintain people's honor and dignity.
Yeah. And I'll have one shout out to the leaders of a couple of organizations. One is Inroads. Then I'll just, you brought up the specifics around systems, and as it relates to things like race, and Inroads is a fantastic organization, and Diversity Inc. is another fantastic anti-racist organization. And the CEO of that organization, I was sharing with some of the challenges that I've had along the way, learning through this. And I remember the CEO saying to me, congratulations, Dave, you've been in this now for a year. We're 400 plus in. So, probably not going to change overnight. And I know it's frustrating. I know you're going through a lot on that particular issue. And I just so appreciate that there's a huge community of people to be able to support and lift each other up and address issues, whether it's about, like I said, anti-racism or gender or sexuality. There's a lot of issues here that are systems of oppression, that there's groups of people that are actually there to help support you through those things. So
I'll make sure to put both of those links in your bio when we publish the episode. That would be really great for others to know a little bit more about them. I will tell you that you'll feel that there is a segment of your population that will say you're not moving fast enough, and another part that will say you're moving too fast. I remember we had all 3,000 of our employees learn about Black Lives Matter through a very thoughtful module that was created by our equity team, and the spouse of one of our teachers called 911 to say that their wife was being forced to confront the fact that she was white. And the 911 operator said, "This is 911."
Again, on this topic, I'm working with a lot of superintendents to get, there's a lot of debates about woke and about DE&I and things like that, but there is no debate that about the language of the fact that belonging and dignity are human rights, and that public school systems are meant to provide belonging, dignity, and overall success for all students. And under that, I think there also is a uniting aspect that people are trying to divide people with language. And so I'm really interested in not the woke versus the anti-woke moment, the DEI versus not the DEI. There's an anti-racist stance that I take 100%. I am an active antiracist, meaning I don't just sit and call it out. I do things actively against it. And also to address this has to do with actually coming at some common understanding of belonging and dignity. I think that people need to push their districts forward, even though they don't agree on some of the language, and people get triggered over, asinine things like your white privilege.
In the end, what was something that was good that came out of that situation?
Progress, personal growth, understanding, more ability to work towards healing. So all of that comes as a result. I don't endorse making foolish errors, but I think that a lot of people don't do anything because they're too afraid to make a mistake. So even with mistakes, I think that a lot of leaders right now are very paralyzed by trying to actually address some big issues because they're afraid of making a mistake. So I'll say that it's absolutely improved our company and myself as a leader to be able to actually even take a swing at attempting these things, and even knowing you're not going to get it right is going to happen. So I would say that there's been a lot of positivity that comes out of trying to do this work, but and I think I would say an increased relationship with people around me through that. In the essence of this podcast, it's just being an imperfect leader, the humanity of being a leader that screws up trying to do the right thing.
Dave, the creation of a tool that helps leaders find common ground with constituents has been, I think, a groundbreaking disruption. And it's been a departure from traditional models and has helped leaders be more predictably successful. And I mean, your examples today really confirm for me the importance of finding ways to move from abstract to concrete, to do it in a way that harvests the wisdom of others. And I just want to thank you so much for being so accessible. Thank you so much for being my guest. It really has meant a lot.
I loved to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader. Leadership in After Action.